Welcome to Talking Art Encyclopedia. Subscribe now and let's start the conversation.
This is Mortimer Adler, a distinguished American philosopher. He charges that the United States is selling its birthright, freedom, for an unjust, ever more socialistic form of society. We'll find out why he says that in a moment. In on the Broadcasting Company, in association with the Fund for the Republic, into a special television series discussing the problems of survival and freedom in America. Good evening, I'm Mike Wallace. Tonight, we'll discuss the nature of freedom, the nature of our society, and how they are protected or perhaps restricted by our government. Our guest is Mortimer Adler, former professor of the philosophy of law at the University of Chicago, now president of the Institute for Philosophical Research. After 7 years of study, Dr. Adler has just published The Idea of Freedom, an examination of the concept and practice of freedom in the past 25 centuries. Dr. Adler, first let me ask you this. As I've said, you've recently concluded a 7-year study of the idea, the concept of freedom as it's developed through history. Since our interest tonight will center around production, industry, and money, I wonder if you'd tell me this. As a result of your studies, what kind of economic system, in your opinion, is most compatible with a free society? Well, let me begin by answering your question, Mr. Wallace, in terms of the meanings of freedom before I come to the economic substructure of a free society. Good. In the studies we've made at the Institute for Philosophical Research in San Francisco, we have found that there are 5 major conceptions of freedom, only one of which is relevant to our present concerns. 2 conceptions of freedom are concerned with the kind of freedom that men would have in any society, under tyranny and death, under the worst conditions. And 2 conceptions are anti-political or unpolitical. They are notions of freedom as doing what one pleases. They are notions of freedom without government, even opposed to government. Only one conception of freedom, that of political liberty, is a truly political conception, and it defines freedom as consisting in the participation in one's own government, that is, having a voice in one's own affairs through the status of citizenship and suffrage. Now, this kind of freedom, the political liberty of a citizen, which in a free society is the right of every man is a citizen with political liberty, I think can be economically sustained, supported, only by the widest diffusion in the ownership of the means of production, of property and the means of production, the kind of thing that our founding fathers, Hamilton, Adams, Jefferson, thought when they said that you couldn't make men citizens if they were dependent upon the arbitrary will of other men for their subsistence. They envisaged a larger and larger class of small property owners, and large middle class, with economic leverage against the government, against the powers of government, as the essential bulwark of a republic. And I think that must be restored again today. What might be called then a purer capitalism than the capitalism that we have? I would say capitalism as it does not exist and it never existed so far. Yes. Well, now, before you go any further, I want to clarify something, if you will permit me this generalization. Attacks on the so-called socialization of the United States usually come from the political right wing in America. This same right wing generally favors extensive congressional investigations of alleged subversives. They favor some restrictions on the right of free speech for communists and so on. You say that we are going socialistic. Do you identify yourself with this militant right wing that I have just described? Heaven forbid. I regard that right wing as the most reactionary and subversive force of good government you could have in this country. That right wing would want to restore us to the kind of primitive, unjust, laissez-faire capitalism, a kind of robber baron capitalism of each man for himself and the devil take the hindmost, which was not conform, did not conform to the idea of political liberty and the good right and the good society. On the contrary, the kind of capitalism I'm talking about is, I would think, even more revolutionary than communism. It aims at all the good human results, the dignities of life and the decencies for all men. With one difference, it wants these things and freedom too. Whereas the idealistic communist, the utopian communist, is looking for the conditions of a good life but can't understand how to get them without the sacrifice of individual freedom. Well, staying with our increasing socialism, if you will, for a moment, what is leading us down the road to this socialism? You have said that our leading economists are doing it, that many of the policies of both political parties, Republican and Democrat, are increasingly socialistic. What I fail to understand, though, is this is a country of big business and huge corporations, ostensibly defenders of free private enterprise. So on what do you base your charge that we are advancing toward a socialist state? Well, let me answer that question in two jumps. First place, in 1848, Karl Marx outlined a program for bringing about socialism progressively and peacefully before the last violent stage of the revolution. He talked about it as progressive inroads into the rights of property, enumerated a set of steps and policies. 2-3 years ago, John Strachey, the leading English Marxist, said Marx made only one error. He didn't see that this socialistic program be brought about by due process of law and peacefully in both England and the United States without any violence at all. And according to Strachey's calculation, we're 2/3 along the way to a completely socialized economy. Let me illustrate this another way. There was a time in the history of this country, in the history of all our Western publics, in which taxation was strictly for the support of government. That is, the tax levels were adjusted to the cost of government. No one would have thought of using taxation and similar devices as a means of redistributing wealth. You and I live in a society in which taxation is largely not for the support of government, for the purposes of redistribution of wealth. We're living in an economy in which the policy of full employment, the policy of unemployment insurance, all the benefits are benefits that are conferred upon people in order to give them the kind of economic security that is necessary to keep the economy running, as well as to give them some measure of political liberty. These are the good aspects of the thing. What's wrong with it is that we are achieving, I think, by the socialization of our economy, the maintenance of some vestiges of private property capitalism, but with increasing power on the part of government. We'll come to that in just a moment. Another of your key criticisms of the present economic system is the way wages are determined, which you call a laboristic distribution of wealth. What do you mean, and what's so bad about it? Well, let me explain that by saying, we're living in a technologically advanced, more advanced industrial society. In that society, it is the capital instruments that are the major factor in the production of wealth. I would roughly say that capital is responsible for 90% of the wealth produced and labor for 10%, perhaps less than that even. Yet 70% of the total annual wealth is distributed to labor in the form of wages, and 30% goes back to capital. In fact, capital earnings. Capital's actual earnings are much less than what capital produces. Labor's actual earnings are much more than labor actually produces. Human labor, manpower, and human skill is a relatively constant thing. The increasing productiveness of our society is not due to the increasing productiveness of labor at all. It's due to the increasing power and productiveness of the major capital instruments. Is what you're saying, labor is being paid too much? Yes. Who will buy the goods unless labor is paid? You are quite right, Mr. Wallace. That is precisely how we got into the jam. At the time of the New Deal, at the time of the various socializing measures, in order to prevent Karl Marx's prediction from coming through that a cycle of depressions would finally make capital collapse of its own weight, we had to adopt measures to increase purchasing power. We did it by policies of full employment and wage rise in real wages of labor. And by the way, any society, any economy, if it's going to have the increasing productiveness of our industrial society, must have some way of seeing that purchasing power is widely distributed, because if you have purchasing power concentrated in the hands of a few wealthy persons, you simply have overproduction under consumption. So that the question is not, I want to see, any economist has to see widely diffused purchasing power. But shall it be produced, shall it be achieved by wage level beyond what labor earns, or by having more and more families get larger share of their incomes, not from wages, but from the dividends on the equity shares of capital that they own? What I want to see is a continually improved standard of living and a widely distributed purchasing power through the diffusion of the ownership of capital, not through artificially boosted wage levels. When Walter Reuther, just this past a few months ago, came up with a profit-sharing plan for labor, what was your reaction to it? I thought he didn't go far enough. Instead of asking for profit sharing, which by the way is somewhat unjust when you ask for profit sharing without the risks of capital, he should have asked properly for equity shares and for equity sharing.
Isn't that what the Ford Motor Company offered the auto worker maybe last year?
No, it was 2 years ago at the time that Ruther was negotiating for guaranteed annual wage. Ford Motor Company offered him as an alternative shares of Ford stock before Ford stock went on the public market. And Ruther turned it down. I've never been able to figure out why. I'm sorry to say that my guess is not complimented Ruther. My guess is that, and this I think is true with many labor leaders, that they're afraid of increased ownership on the part of labor because it reduces the class struggle. And eventually, the kind of capitalism I'm talking about would gradually liquidate all labor unions. Labor unions were necessary only when capitalism was in its primitive condition. Labor had to fight for some conditions of life. In a good society, we wouldn't have labor unions. Of course, big business in a good society wouldn't have labor unions. You wouldn't need labor unions. In a classless society of capitalists, you wouldn't need labor unions.
Is a classless society possible?
I firmly believe it's the only free society. Let me say why I think so. In any society which you have basic factions, particularly economic factions, you will have, as our Federalists taught, either a tyranny of the minority or a tyranny of the majority. And between them, there's much choice. They're both tyrannies. You can only avoid the tyranny of the majority or the minority in a classless society.
But in a dynamic society, isn't tyranny inevitable eventually?
No, I don't think so. We've been talking a little bit about labor. Of course, big business depends upon certain socialistic devices, government regulation of various industries, subsidy handouts. The handouts to capital are almost as bad as the handouts to labor.
But what I can't get in this, Dr. Adler, are you simply recording history when you say what is happening, or are you recording history and then reacting to what is going on? What I would like to know is what, in your estimation, is bad about all of this? I think that you can agree. I did wonder how many people watching us tonight, for instance, really worry about the so-called trend toward socialization. Really. For instance, last month, Congress voted a 7% rise in Social Security. Now, some people would call this a socialistic measure. But do you think that you're ever going to convince a man who's worked all his life with a small income that increased Social Security is a bad thing for him when he returns?
Not unless you give something better. I agree with you. Certainly the large, massive working people in this country are much better off in 1958 than they were in 1928 and they were in 1898. No question about it.
All right.
And since they can't see any alternative, since they can't see how their present economic security, their present economic welfare can be achieved except by such socialistic measures, so long as that's the case, they've got to vote this in. No question about it. The problem is one of education. The problem is one of having them see that it is by their ceasing to be workers. By the way, and this will have to happen anyway, because no matter what anyone tries to do, we can't maintain full employment very much longer without an absolutely destructive inflation. We've got to recognize that labor, I'm talking about particularly mechanical labor, in the major industries, has to be gradually retired, less and less of it. We have to have an economy in which people's incomes are achieved from other sources than the kind of wages in the full employment industries we're talking about. Hence, I think we have to have the people of the country understand that all the good things they've fought for and really gained through the socialistic measures, the socializing of the economy during the last 35 or 40 years, have to be retained and solidified by other means, and those means I would call the capitalistic means. We said one other thing, Mr. Wallace. Madison Avenue, has a big hullabaloo about people's capitalism. It's good for foreign consumption. Actually, of course, we don't have people's capitalism in the United States. The idea being, the idea behind that phrase, stolen from the Russian phrase, people's democracy, is a society in which, to use the slogan, every man is a capitalist. Now, this is the idea. That's your idea. Every man is citizen. Let me say why it's my idea.
Yes.
Citizenship, being a citizen and being a property owner, I think go together. I think we have, and this has always been the case, by the way, the greatest of political theorists in the past have understood that the kind of economic independence that men have through being owners of property is an indispensable condition or qualification of their being good citizens. We have the first society to extend its suffrage way beyond the diffusion of property. And we've done it by securing the equivalence of property. All of our social security measures, all of our labor legislation is property in itself. No, it's not property. It's power. In other words, the benefits are secured by power, not by property and by right.
Yeah.
And you say, what's wrong with that? The whole problem is one of power. Freedom. The whole problem of freedom is one of proper control of power.
What I'm getting at here is this. Let's grant that we are moving away from absolutely free capitalism. It would appear that this is being done because the majority of our citizens want it that way. Now, isn't there the concept of a kind of a collective freedom, a social freedom, in which all the citizens vote freely and the majority rules, and the minorities and individuals have to accept this majority rule?
The process by which we have moved away from what you call free capitalism, which I rather call the round-minded laissez-faire capitalism of the 19th century. The process by which we have moved away is a perfectly legitimate process of democratic government, majority rule, yes. The question is, can the majority be mistaken in its own aims? I mean, can a majority, do men ever make a mistake with the right goal in mind, choose the wrong means for it? I've said our country, proceeding peacefully and by due process of law, is making the wrong choice, and the people are making the wrong choice for themselves.
But then what you complain about are injustices and violations and invasions of the rights of private property.
That's right.
When you attack socialistic measures, aren't you saying that rules are incompatible with a free society because they are based upon compulsion, government compulsion mainly?
I think, though I would deny that they're involved in some compulsion, freedom, I think is more endangered by the concentration of power that results. Let me use Russia as an example for a moment. In Russia, you have the greatest possible concentration of economic and political power in the same hands. The managers of the economy are also the managers of the political machinery of the state. This, to my mind, is most inimical, most incompatible with individual freedom and individual rights. Now, in this country, we haven't lost our freedom yet. And I want to be clear about this. I'm not seeing any boogaboos and scareheads around the corner at the moment. We have socialized our economy and still maintained our political freedom, as has Italy. The only thing I want to be clear about on this is that if the socializing trend continues, if what I think is worse, the built-in inflation and the inevitable overprotection left in our society continues, I think you will have, at the end of the road, perhaps not longer than 50 years, a much more complete socialism, a socialism as complete as in Russia, in which case I think freedom will be lost.
Well, right here is where you would seem possibly to contradict yourself. Well, you claim to be a champion of capitalism and free enterprise.
Capitalism as it has never existed yet.
As it has never existed.
Yeah.
But you say in your book that the only way to achieve this free enterprise is with a series of powerful government controls.
I agree.
To list a few: greatly expanded use of present corporate income taxes, government regulation of business corporations, heavy gift and estate taxes in many cases, even a sharply progressive income tax. Now, it seems to me that this is a certain kind of socialism all over again. Is it not self-defeating you?
No. I've thought about this particular question. You've heard me say 3 or 4 times that capitalism must not be confused with laissez-faire. The capitalist society is not one in which you have no government regulation. The difference is there are 2 points. One, between government regulation of the economy, like government regulation of traffic, and 2, government operation of the economy. The government should not be engaged in the production of wealth or the distribution of wealth, but should regulate in terms of principles of justice the ownership, production, and distribution of wealth. Secondly, government regulation can either produce socialism or capitalism. And I say, if in the transition, I'm talking about revolutionary transition, if in the transition toward capitalism, to the kind of capitalism I'm talking about, you have government regulation, it tends to liquidate itself, because at the end of the line, when you have capitalism in existence with a large, let's say almost universal ownership of means of production, you have John Adams and Alexander Hamilton picture, Thomas Jefferson's picture of society in which you have not a large middle class, but a whole middle class, a single middle class, if you will, only the middle class, of property owners who have extraordinary independence of government by the very rights of property. In other words, government regulation for the sake of promoting capitalism is government regulation for the sake of freedom.
All right, government regulation for the sake of promoting capitalism. Let me ask you this, then, in this context. Recently, George Romney, who's the head of American Motors, called for legislation that would prohibit any corporation from capturing more than 35% of a given market in its particular field. This, says Mr. Romney, would encourage free enterprise and competition. Would you agree with this kind of regulation? Not the 35% necessarily, in the principle.
I would certainly agree with the principle that in fact, government regulation is absolutely necessary to maintain freely competitive markets. You remove government regulation and you get monopoly within 10 years. I mean, you can't maintain free and competitive markets except by regulation, by preventions of monopolies of all kinds.
But what you're saying is this. Freedom, a man makes a better motor car or a better brand of toothpaste or a better television set, and the public flocks to him of their own free will.
Surely.
But you're saying that if he gets too much of that market, knock the public off. Well, let him get more. I'll pay you 1%. And certainly this is no freedom.
Let me leave out the 35% because that's a figure I can't for sure understand. I think perhaps the difference between you and me at the moment is that I don't mean by freedom unlimited freedom. I don't mean by freedom license. I don't mean by freedom doing what you please. I mean by freedom within the framework of justice and of rights. And I don't believe that a freedom should permit anyone to get anything he can get, or that unlimitedly, for example, the Capitalist Manifesto, which Mr. Kelson and I wrote, holds very firmly the proposition there should be some limitation on the concentrations of capital ownership. Why? Because every man has a right to earn a viable income for himself and his family by the industrial means of our society. If there are you have a highly concentrated ownership of capital resources, that right is infringed. I'm quite willing to limit the freedom of a man to become a multi-billionaire in order to see that human rights are protected. And I do not think this is really an infringement of freedom at all, because unless one means by freedom the right to do anything one pleases, which I think is a false meaning of freedom, or certainly false meaning of political liberty.
Of course, there are some people in this country who take a much stronger viewpoint than you do. They say that government has no right to interfere with anybody's private property for any reason, that the only function of government should be to protect its citizens from aggression.
I think the whole function of government is to do justice and seek, the lines of the Declaration, to secure these rights. The function of government, when we understand what man's natural rights are, is to secure these rights.
One more aspect of this problem. I think you'd agree that capitalism is a competitive, aggressive system which considers material benefits and progress as important to mankind. Can any system accept capitalism which also accepts Christianity?
That's an interesting and difficult question, Mr. Wallace. I would think that capitalism and socialism both, insofar as they are organizations of an industrial economy, shall I say, inconsistent with the spirit of Christianity. Or put another way, Christianity finds the Christian life, the ideal Christian life, is more difficult to live in a modern industrial society. Whereas in a less affluent, less opulent, less materially well-off society. I don't think it makes much difference, really, whether that modern industrial society with an abundance of wealth, affluent in such sophisticated, called it an affluent society, is organized in a capitalistic or a socialistic fashion. I think Christianity is a more difficult life, more difficult preachment in our modern world than it was under conditions of poverty and hardship. In fact, Christianity was born under conditions of poverty and hardship, and prospered under them. I mean, it's impossible, by the way. Or let me say one other thing. I think capitalism, as I understand it, is quite compatible with a pagan ideal of a virtuous and good life, less compatible with a Christian ideal of virtuous and good life. Because the pagan ideal was based upon worldly goods and worldly achievement.
You're not suggesting that you're anti-Christian.
No. I would think there's a problem here.
You pay lip service to justice.
Lip service? Why do you say I pay lip service to justice? Well, I pay service to justice.
Lip service and service, and actual service to justice in your writing. So indeed does Christianity pay lip service and service to justice. And yet you find yourself at odds with Christianity.
May I,
to some small extent.
May I distinguish here? The basic principle of Christianity is not justice, but charity. Charity is beyond, real charity, sense in which St. Paul says faith, hope, and charity, and the growth of these is charity, is outside the secular order. It is a theological virtue, spiritual virtue, and in my understanding, Christian theology, not possessed by anyone without God's grace. This is beyond the problems of political and economic organization. Justice is a rational matter, a rational principle. Justice, even if there were no God and no religion, if man were a purely natural thing, there was no creator, supernatural order, there would still be principles of justice. But there'd be no principles of charity without God. It's only in some sense, through God's love and man's love of his fellow man through God, that one has charity. That's the essence of the Christian life, not justice.
One final area of discussion, one final question, Dr. Adler. What do you believe is the wave of the future, politically, economical?
I have believed for many years that the Tocqueville's prophecy is right, that the future belongs to the classless society of men living under conditions of equality, both economic and political equality, the true and classless society that can be brought about by economic and political democracy. I really think the future belongs to democracy as an ideal which will be progressively achieved in the next hundreds or thousands of years.
What kind of a democracy do you talk about?
Democracy which involves constitutional government by law, the universal suffrage of giving each man the equal dignity of citizenship, the political liberty that goes with it, and added now the economic independence of property.
How do you account then for this momentary aberration in the other direction?
Because we've seen in the last 100 years a most extraordinary revolution in the conditions of our life through industrialization. We haven't mastered yet. You see, neither socialism nor capitalism, and hence what I'm talking about, could possibly have existed over 100 years ago. I mean, they are brought in, the revolutions of our time evidently take their origin from technological changes, the changes in the actual means and conditions of production. We're living in a free society where there's enough wealth to be distributed. We're living in a free society where it's possible to say that every man could be a capitalist.
And so we haven't really learned, we haven't begun to solve the problem our society creates for us. Mortimer Adler, I thank you for coming here from San Francisco and spending this half hour with us.
I do.
Mortimer Adler equates capitalism with freedom. One is impossible without the other, he said. Yet to strengthen economic freedom and capitalism, he himself called for some degree of government regulation. This would seem to raise a few questions. Is absolute freedom a good? Is it necessary? Is it practical? On the other hand, if you don't have absolute freedom, if we grant the principle that a man's freedom should be restricted by government or by majority demand, do we really have freedom at all?
And how to put up that shower.
Next week, we'll discuss the responsibilities of political parties, pressure groups, and the individual citizen in a free society. Our guest, you see him behind me, will be the man who's been called the eggman of the Republican Party, the man who articulated the philosophy of modern republicanism. He's Arthur Larson, who just resigned from the Eisenhower administration after 4 years of service. First as Undersecretary of Labor, and later as head of the United States Information Agency and Special Assistant to the President. That's Arthur Larson on the issue of political parties and the individual citizen in a democracy next week. Till then, like Wallace, good night.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe for more.